The moment I saw the human standing at the far end of the hall, my hands went cold. Not because he looked dangerous. He did not. He looked ordinary, almost forgettable, dressed in a simple gray coat with his hands folded in front of him. That was exactly why I had chosen him. But as the doors sealed shut behind me and the wedding ceremony began, I felt something twist in my chest, a warning I did not understand yet, and chose to ignore. My name is Vel Corson. I am an administrator of the Ashen Concord, and I have spent my whole life making careful decisions. Every choice I make is built on data, on patterns, on knowing exactly what will happen before it happens. That is how our people survive. We do not gamble. We do not trust luck. And when it came time to choose a husband for my daughter Ezra, I did what I always do. I studied the numbers. Humans were new to the wider galaxy back then, still trying to prove they belonged among older, more established species. They were eager, hungry for alliances, desperate to be taken seriously. That made them useful. That made them, I believed, safe. A human husband would never challenge our traditions. He would be grateful simply to be included. He would give Ezra a comfortable life, a quiet life, and most importantly, a life I could predict from beginning to end. I searched through hundreds of profiles before I found him. Daniel Reyes, a cargo engineer stationed on a small trade outpost near the edge of Concord space. No family of importance, no military record, no political connections, no accomplishments listed anywhere that would make him stand out in a crowd. On paper, he was nobody, and nobody was exactly what I wanted for my daughter's husband. A nobody could not hurt her. A nobody could not embarrass our family. A nobody would simply be thankful. Ezra did not agree with me. She never did. On the night before the ceremony, she stood in her room with her arms crossed, refusing to look at the wedding dress laid out across her bed. "You do not even know him," she said. "You picked a stranger for me because he looked easy to control." I told her that love was not something our people needed to build a life on. I told her that safety mattered more than feelings, that a predictable partner was a gift, not a punishment. She did not believe me. I could see it in the way her jaw tightened, the way she turned away from me instead of arguing further. But tradition is tradition, and in the end, she wore the dress. The wedding took place in the great hall of our settlement, beneath high windows that let in pale afternoon light. Rows of Concord officials sat on one side, dressed in formal robes, their faces calm and unreadable as always. On the other side sat a small group of humans, colleagues and neighbors of Daniel's, dressed far more simply than our own people. I remember thinking how strange it was that so few of them had come. If he truly had no accomplishments, no reputation, then why did the ones who did come look at him the way they did? I noticed it first during the walk down the hall. Yisra moved beside her father, her steps slow and stiff, her eyes fixed straight ahead. Daniel stood waiting at the front, and as she approached, he did something I did not expect. He smiled, not a wide, foolish grin, but something small and steady, the kind of smile that says, "I see you, and I am not afraid of what you are feeling right now." Yisra's shoulders loosened slightly, just slightly, enough that I noticed. I turned my attention to the humans seated across the aisle, expecting to see the same nervous, eager expressions I had read about in my research. Instead, I saw something else. A woman near the front kept her eyes on Daniel with quiet respect, almost like a soldier watching an officer they trusted completely. An older man beside her gave a small nod when Daniel walked past, the kind of nod exchanged between equals, not between strangers meeting a groom for the first time. None of them looked at him with pity, the way I expected people to look at a man marrying into a family of higher standing than his own. They looked at him like he mattered, like he had always mattered. I told myself it meant nothing. Humans had their own customs, their own ways of showing respect that I did not fully understand yet. I was an outsider to their culture, just as they were outsiders to mine. It was foolish to read too much into a nod, a glance, a quiet exchange between strangers I would likely never speak to again. The ceremony continued. Words were exchanged. Promises were made, in both the old Concord tongue and in plain human speech. a compromise that had taken months of negotiation between our families. Daniel spoke his vows clearly, without hesitation, without the nervous stumbling I expected from someone standing in a hall full of people who were, by every measure that mattered to my people, above him. His voice was calm, steady, almost too steady for someone marrying into a family of political importance for the very first time. When it came time for him to place the marriage band on Ezra's hand, I watched his fingers. They did not shake. I remember thinking that was strange, the kind of detail that should not have mattered, but somehow lodged itself in my mind and refused to leave. Every other human groom I had read about during my research trembled during this part of the ceremony, overwhelmed by the weight of what they were entering into. Daniel simply took her hand like he had done it 1,000 times before, gentle, sure, unhurried. After the vows were spoken, a reception was held in the outer courtyard, where long tables had been set with food from both our worlds. I moved through the crowd the way I always did at these events, listening more than speaking, gathering small pieces of information the way I gathered everything else in my life. I overheard 2 Concord officials speaking quietly near the far wall. "Did you see who attended?" one of them said. "Only a handful of humans came. For a man supposedly connected to a whole engineering division, you would expect more." "Maybe he does not have many friends," the other replied, "or maybe the ones who matter are not the kind who show up to weddings." I did not think much of it at the time. I filed it away the way I filed away every piece of information, without urgency, without alarm. It was simply data. Data I would return to later, though I did not know that yet. Later that evening, as the sun began to set behind the settlement's outer wall, I found myself standing near Daniel while Ezra was pulled away by a group of relatives eager to offer their congratulations. It was the first time I had spoken to him directly since the arrangements had been finalized weeks earlier. "I hope you understand what this marriage means," I told him. "My daughter comes from a family with responsibilities, expectations. I trust you will not make things difficult for her." He looked at me for a long moment before answering, and something in his expression made me feel, for just a heartbeat, like I was the one being studied instead of him. "I only want her to be happy," he said. "That is all I am here for." It was a simple answer, the kind of answer I expected from a man with nothing else to offer but good intentions. I nodded, satisfied, and turned to walk away, already planning the next steps of managing this new arrangement, already thinking of Daniel as a small, manageable piece in a much larger structure I controlled. I did not look back at him again that night. If I had, I might have noticed the way he watched the crowd, instead of enjoying his own wedding, his eyes moving carefully over every exit, every gathering of strangers, every shadow near the courtyard wall, the way a man watches a room when he has spent years learning that comfort is something you earn through vigilance, not something you are simply given. I did not know yet who I had truly brought into my family. I only knew that the numbers had matched, that the profile had fit, that everything about Daniel Reyes appeared calm, quiet, and safely beneath notice. I would spend the following months slowly learning how wrong I had been, one small unsettling moment at a time, until the day arrived when the truth could no longer be filed away as simply data. But on that first evening, standing in the courtyard with the sound of celebration around me, I still believed I had made the safest, smartest choice of my daughter's life. I was already wrong. I simply did not know it yet. The first crack in my certainty appeared 3 weeks after the wedding, during a routine dispute over shipping routes that should never have involved me at all. I only heard about it because a colleague mentioned it in passing, expecting me to laugh along with her at the story. Instead, I felt my stomach tighten in a way I did not like. A Concord official named Bren Halsey had been assigned to inspect cargo manifests at the outpost where Daniel worked. Halsey was known for being difficult, the kind of official who enjoyed reminding humans of their place in the wider order of things. According to my colleague, Halsey had confronted Daniel directly, accusing him of falsifying delivery records to cover a missed shipment. He had raised his voice. He had threatened to have Daniel's work permit reviewed. He had done everything a man like Halsey does when he wants someone smaller than himself to feel afraid. Daniel had not raised his voice back. He had not argued or pleaded or apologized the way I expected. According to the two witnesses who later spoke of it, he had simply looked at Halsey, said a handful of calm words, and waited. Nobody could tell my colleague exactly what those words were. But whatever they were, Halsey had gone pale, gathered his files without another sound, and left the outpost without filing a single complaint. My colleague thought it was funny. A big important official, silenced by a quiet human cargo worker. I did not think it was funny at all. I thought about it for the rest of that day, turning the story over in my mind, the way I turn over any piece of information that does not fit the pattern I expect. Men like Daniel, according to everything I had researched, were supposed to shrink under pressure from officials like Halsey. They were supposed to be grateful for whatever scraps of respect they were given. Daniel had not shrunk. He had made an experienced Concord official retreat without lifting a hand. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Perhaps Halsey had simply realized his accusation was unfounded and left to avoid embarrassment. Perhaps the story had grown larger in the retelling, as stories often do. I filed it away again, the way I file away everything, and I told myself I was imagining significance where there was none. But then came the second moment, and the second moment was harder to explain away. A human diplomat named Grace Odell visited our settlement for trade discussions a month later. I attended the formal dinner that followed the negotiations, mostly out of duty rather than interest. At some point during the evening, Ezra's name came up in conversation, and with it, the mention of her new husband. "She is married to Daniel Reyes," someone said, "the engineer from the outer trade outpost." I watched Grace Odell's face carefully, the way I watch every face in a room full of strangers, searching for reactions I could later analyze. For just a moment, her composed diplomatic expression flickered. Her eyes widened slightly. Her fork paused halfway to her mouth. Then, just as quickly, she recovered, smiling politely and saying only that she wished the couple happiness, before carefully steering the conversation towards something else entirely. It was such a small thing. A pause. A flicker. Most people at the table did not even notice it happened. But I noticed, because noticing small things was my entire profession, and what I noticed did not match anything in Daniel's file. Ordinary cargo engineers did not make seasoned diplomats pause mid-sentence. Ordinary cargo engineers did not silence difficult officials with a handful of quiet words. Something about the file I had studied so carefully was incomplete, and the realization sat uneasily in my chest for the rest of the evening. I began, quietly, to look deeper. I told myself I was simply being a careful mother, the same way I had been careful when I first selected him. There was nothing wrong with double-checking, with confirming that the peaceful, predictable life I had promised my daughter was truly what she was receiving. I used my administrative access, the kind of access most citizens never had, to pull deeper records on Daniel Reyes. What I found, or rather, what I did not find, unsettled me more than any dramatic revelation could have. His public record was almost entirely clean, almost suspiciously clean. Education records existed up to a certain point, then simply stopped for nearly 6 years before resuming again with his current position as a cargo engineer. Employment history showed the same gap, 6 years unaccounted for, with no explanation offered anywhere in the file. When I tried to access deeper human military and government records, hoping to fill that gap, I was met with a single line of text I had never encountered before in any file I had ever reviewed. Access restricted. Classification beyond current clearance. I stared at that line for a long time. In all my years working within Concord administration, I had reviewed thousands of files belonging to humans, aliens, traders, officials, even a handful of dangerous individuals flagged by security divisions. I had never once encountered a restriction level higher than my own clearance. My position gave me access to nearly everything within Concord space. For a simple cargo engineer's file to be locked beyond even that meant something about Daniel Reyes was not simple at all. I sat with that discovery for 3 days before I allowed myself to fully process what it meant. During those 3 days, I visited Isra and Daniel's small home near the outpost, telling myself it was an ordinary visit, a mother checking on her daughter, nothing more. I watched them together carefully, searching for any sign of danger, any hint that the man behind that locked file was someone Isra needed protecting from. What I saw instead confused me even further. Yizra was happy, not the polite, performed happiness she had always shown at family gatherings, but something quieter and more real. She laughed at something Daniel said while preparing a meal, an easy, unguarded laugh I had rarely heard from her before the wedding. She leaned against him without thinking about it, the way people do when they no longer feel the need to protect themselves from the person beside them. When a loud noise startled her from outside, she flinched, and Daniel's hand found her shoulder instantly, steady and calm, before either of them even seemed to register what had happened. That reflex bothered me more than anything else I had seen. It was too fast, too practiced, the kind of reaction that comes from years of training, not from a man who spent his days repairing cargo systems on a quiet outpost. I asked him about the gap in his records that evening, as directly as I dared. I framed it as simple curiosity, the kind of question any mother might ask about a son-in-law's past. "You worked as an engineer before the outpost," I said. "What did you do before that?" He did not look away from me, and he did not stumble over his answer the way someone hiding something usually does. His voice stayed calm, even gentle. "I worked somewhere that does not exist on paper anymore," he said. "It is not something I am allowed to talk about, and honestly, it is not something I want to talk about. That part of my life is over. I am not that person anymore." It was an answer that told me nothing and everything at once. I wanted to press further, to demand real information the way I demanded it from every official who ever tried to withhold something from me. But something in his eyes stopped me, a quiet weight behind his calm expression that made me understand, for the first time, that whatever lay behind that locked file was not something I was prepared to hear yet. I left that evening telling myself, once again, that I was imagining threats where none existed. Isra was happy. Daniel was gentle and patient with her. Whatever secret he carried clearly had nothing to do with the danger my instincts kept warning me about. Perhaps every human institution kept certain records sealed for reasons that had nothing to do with violence or danger. Perhaps I was simply unfamiliar with human bureaucracy, seeing shadows and gaps that meant nothing at all. I decided, against every instinct that had ever served me well in my career, to stop searching. I told myself Daniel was a good man, quiet and reserved by nature, and that whatever history he carried was his own business, not mine to uncover. I convinced myself that the flicker in Grace Odell's expression, the silence from Bren Halsey, the locked file beyond my clearance, were simply strange coincidences with simple, boring explanations I was too paranoid to accept. I was wrong to stop searching. I was wrong to convince myself the danger I sensed was imagination rather than instinct. But I would not understand exactly how wrong until the day the outpost went silent and every quiet detail I had chosen to ignore came rushing back to me with a force I never could have prepared for. The alert came through my console at the worst possible hour, deep in the sleeping cycle, when the settlement outside my window was dark and silent. I remember sitting up so fast the blanket slid off the bed before my mind had even fully processed the words on the screen. All communications lost with Outer Trade Outpost 7. Status unknown. Outpost 7. That was Isra's outpost. That was where Daniel worked, where their small home sat near the edge of the docking bay, where I had watched them laugh together only weeks before. My hands shook as I reached for the console, pulling up every channel I had access to, trying to raise anyone at all, who could tell me what was happening. Nothing came back but silence. I contacted the regional security office immediately, using every level of authority my position allowed. The officer on duty sounded exhausted and frightened in equal measure, the kind of voice that belongs to someone repeating information they do not fully understand themselves. "We lost contact almost an hour ago," she said. "Sensor readings before the blackout showed unregistered ships entering the docking perimeter. We believe it is a raid, Krathi remnant, based on the ship signatures. We are assembling a response fleet, but it will not reach the outpost for several hours." Several hours. I said the words back to her as though repeating them might somehow make them shorter, might somehow speed up ships that were still gathering fuel and crew hundreds of systems away. My daughter was on that outpost. My daughter was somewhere in the dark, in danger, and there was nothing I could do but wait for information that refused to come. I have heard of the Crothy Remnant before, scattered fighters left over from a conflict that had officially ended years earlier, refusing to accept peace, surviving through raids on smaller settlements that could not defend themselves properly. They did not take prisoners for ransom. They took supplies, weapons, anything valuable, and they left destruction behind them as a warning to anyone who might resist. The thought of Isra anywhere near people like that made it hard to breathe. I spent the following hours pacing through my quarters, contacting every official I knew, demanding updates that nobody could give me. Time moved strangely during that stretch, sometimes crawling so slowly I thought the clock on my console had frozen, sometimes rushing forward so fast I lost entire minutes without noticing. All I could think about was Isra's laugh from that evening in her kitchen, the way she had leaned against Daniel without fear, the way his hand had found her shoulder before either of them had time to think. When partial communications finally returned to Outpost 7, nearly 3 hours after the alert first came through, I was given access to fragmented sensor logs and a handful of recovered comm recordings. My position allowed me to view them before the official report was even finished, and I forced myself to sit through every second, even as my chest tightened with each new piece of footage. The first thing I saw was chaos. Docking bay cameras showed unregistered ships breaking through the perimeter, armed figures moving through corridors meant for cargo transport, alarms flashing red across every visible screen. Civilians ran in every direction, some toward shelter points, others simply running from the nearest threat without any clear plan at all. It was exactly the kind of scene I had feared, disorder and panic spreading through people who had never trained for anything like this. Then the footage shifted to a different camera, one positioned near the central supply corridor, and I saw Daniel. He was not running, he was not hiding. He moved through the chaos with a kind of calm that did not belong in that corridor, directing a group of frightened civilians toward a shelter door with quick, clear instructions, checking behind them constantly, positioning himself between the group and the direction the danger was coming from. His voice, picked up faintly by the corridor microphone, carried none of the panic around him. Left corridor is clear. Move now. Do not stop. Do not look back. I will catch up. It was the voice of someone who had done this before. Not once, not twice, but many times. The kind of calm that only comes from repetition, from training so deep it no longer needed conscious thought to activate. I watched him herd nearly a dozen civilians to safety in under 2 minutes, moving with an efficiency that felt entirely at odds with the quiet, unremarkable cargo engineer I had chosen from a file months earlier. Then the footage showed something that made my breath catch entirely. A group of children, no older than the youngest years of schooling, had become separated from their families during the panic, cornered near a maintenance junction by 2 armed raiders who were clearly searching for anything of value to steal before security forces arrived. The children were pressed against the wall, too frightened to scream, too frightened to move. Daniel appeared at the end of the corridor within seconds, moving faster than I had seen him move in the earlier footage, faster than I believed a man his size should have been able to move. What happened next occurred quickly enough that the grainy footage struggled to capture every detail clearly, but the outcome was unmistakable. Within moments, both raiders were down, disarmed, no longer a threat to anyone in that corridor. The children were unharmed, gathered quickly, and moved toward the shelter point Daniel had directed the earlier group toward, his voice once again calm, steady, reassuring them the entire way. I sat frozen in front of my console, unable to look away, unable to fully process what I was seeing. This was not the man from the file. This was not a nervous cargo engineer grateful for the chance to marry into a respected family. This was someone else entirely, someone whose calm competence in the middle of chaos spoke of years I knew nothing about, years locked behind a clearance level higher than my own. The recovered comm recordings gave me something else I was not prepared for. Buried among the emergency channels, I found a segment of audio from Isra's personal comm unit, activated sometime during the raid. I expected screaming. I expected fear, the kind of raw panic anyone would feel trapped in the middle of an armed attack. What I heard instead left me staring at the screen in stunned silence. Yzra's voice came through clearly, steady, almost sharp with focus. Two more coming from the east corridor. I have visual. They are moving toward the fuel storage section. A pause, then Daniel's voice responding, calm and quick. Copy that. Get everyone else behind the blast doors and seal them. I will handle the east corridor. Yzra was not hiding. She was not simply following instructions blindly. She was giving tactical information, clear and precise, the kind of communication that comes from someone who understood, at least in part, what her husband had once been trained to do, and had absorbed more of it than either of them had ever let on to me or to anyone else in our family. I did not know whether to feel proud or terrified. Perhaps both feelings were true at once. My daughter, the woman I had tried so carefully to protect through a marriage I believed would keep her safely away from danger, had somehow become someone capable of standing steady in the middle of an armed raid, calm enough to relay information under pressure that would have broken most people I had ever known. The response fleet arrived roughly 4 hours after the initial attack began. By the time reinforcements reached the outpost, the raiders were already retreating, their numbers reduced significantly from whatever damage had been done during those chaotic hours before help arrived. Official casualty reports listed no civilian deaths, a number so fortunate it seemed almost impossible given the scale of the attack described in the sensor logs. I did not sleep at all that night. I sat in front of my console until the first messages confirming Yzra and Daniel's safety finally came through. A short, simple text that told me almost nothing about what had actually happened, only that they were both alive, both unharmed, both being processed through medical checks alongside the other survivors. I read that message perhaps 100 times before I finally allowed myself to believe it. Relief flooded through me so completely that my hands trembled against the edge of the console, but beneath that relief sat something else, something colder and more unsettling. Everything I had built my understanding of Daniel Reyes on, every careful assumption from his file, every prediction I had made about his weakness, his gratitude, his need to be controlled, had been shattered in a single night by footage I could not stop replaying in my mind. I had chosen a man I believed was harmless because harmless was safe, because harmless meant I could control the shape of my daughter's future. But the man in that footage was not harmless. He had simply, deliberately, chosen to appear that way, and I did not yet understand why, or what else that choice might be hiding. I boarded the first available transport to the outpost the following morning, unable to wait for official reports, unable to sit still with so many unanswered questions pressing against my chest. I needed to see Yzra with my own eyes. I needed to look at Daniel and understand, finally, exactly who my daughter had married, and exactly how wrong I had been from the very beginning. The medical bay at Outpost 7 smelled of cleaning chemicals and burnt wiring when I arrived, a sharp reminder of how close the attack had come to destroying everything within those walls. I found Yzra sitting on the edge of a recovery bed, a thin bandage wrapped around her forearm, her eyes tired but alert. The moment she saw me, something in her expression softened, though I could tell she was bracing herself for questions she did not yet want to answer. I did not ask her anything at first. I simply held her, longer than I usually allowed myself, longer than our people's customs typically encouraged between mother and daughter. She let me, which told me more about how frightening the night had truly been than any report ever could have. Daniel was not in the room. A nurse told me he had been assisting with the cleanup efforts near the fuel storage section since early morning, refusing to rest despite instructions from the medical staff. That did not surprise me anymore. Nothing about him seemed to fit the pattern of an ordinary man these days. It was later that afternoon, while Yzra rested and I waited in a small administrative office borrowed from outpost security, that a stranger arrived asking specifically for me. He introduced himself as Colonel Peter Lang, a human envoy sent to formally assess the incident on behalf of a division I had never heard mentioned in any official document before. His uniform bore no insignia I recognized, and his expression carried the careful neutrality of someone who had spent years learning to reveal nothing unless necessary. "You are Vel Corson," he said, taking a seat across from me without waiting for an invitation. "Mother of Ezra Corson, married to Daniel Reyes." I confirmed it, watching him carefully, sensing immediately that this conversation was not going to be the simple procedural interview I expected. "I understand you reviewed the incident footage through your administrative access," he continued. "I am not here to reprimand you for that. Given the circumstances, I think it is time someone explained a few things to you directly, rather than leaving you to draw your own conclusions from restricted files and locked records." I sat forward, my hands folded tightly in my lap, bracing myself for whatever was coming. "Daniel was not always a cargo engineer," Lang said. "Before he came to this outpost, he served for nearly 6 years in a specialized division created during humanity's earliest and most dangerous encounters with hostile species across this region of space. That division does not officially exist anymore. Its records were sealed, its operations dissolved, and most of its former members were quietly reintegrated into ordinary civilian life, partly for their own safety, partly out of diplomatic necessity towards certain species who would not react well to knowing exactly what that division had once been capable of." I asked him, my voice quieter than I intended, what exactly that division had done. Lang chose his words carefully, the way someone speaks when they are deliberately avoiding painting too vivid a picture. "They were sent into situations most conventional forces refuse to handle," he said. "Hostage recoveries, extractions from hostile territory, defense of settlements during conflicts too small or too politically sensitive for larger military involvement. The unit was small, highly trained, and extremely effective. Effective enough that certain species specifically requested, through diplomatic channels, that all records of the unit's methods be permanently sealed once the most dangerous years of first contact came to an end. It was considered a mutual courtesy, a way of allowing everyone involved to move forward without old fears resurfacing. I thought of the footage from the raid, the calm efficiency in Daniel's movements, the speed with which he had handled the raiders threatening those children. I thought of Bren Halsey's sudden retreat, of Grace Odell's flicker of recognition at the dinner table months earlier. Every strange detail I had chosen to dismiss suddenly made perfect, unsettling sense. "Why did he leave?" I asked. "If he was truly as skilled as you are describing, why give it up for a quiet posting on a small trade outpost?" Lang's expression shifted slightly, something almost gentle appearing behind his otherwise composed features. "Because he asked to leave," Lang said simply. "Most people in that line of work do not get the choice. Daniel did, because of certain circumstances I am not able to discuss in detail. He chose an ordinary life. He chose quiet. He never once tried to use his history for advantage, never mentioned it in any official capacity since his discharge, never sought recognition for what he did during those years. As far as I am aware, the only reason I am telling you any of this now is because the incident last night forced a level of exposure none of us anticipated, and someone in your position deserved an honest explanation rather than continued silence." I sat in that borrowed office for a long time after Lang left, staring at the wall, trying to reconcile everything I thought I knew about the man I had chosen for my daughter, with the picture now forming in my mind. I had selected Daniel Reyes because I believed him weak, because I believed his species was, as a whole, still finding its footing among older civilizations, easily controlled, easily satisfied with whatever scraps of status a marriage into my family might offer him. I had been catastrophically wrong. I found Daniel later that evening near the outpost's damaged supply yard, helping a small team clear debris from a collapsed section of scaffolding. He looked exhausted, his sleeves rolled up, dust and grime covering his forearms, nothing about his posture suggesting the calm, controlled figure from the raid footage. When he saw me approaching, he set down the beam he was carrying and walked toward me, his expression cautious, as though he already knew what conversation was coming. "I spoke to Colonel Lang," I said, not bothering with any gentler way to begin. "He told me about your service, about the division, about why your records were sealed." Daniel did not look surprised. He simply nodded once, slowly, waiting for whatever judgment I was about to deliver. "I owe you an apology," I continued, the words feeling strange and unfamiliar in my mouth. "I chose you because I believed you would be easy to manage, because I believed your species, and you specifically, would be grateful enough for this marriage that you would never challenge anything, never complicate the life I had planned for my daughter. I was wrong about all of it." Daniel was quiet for a long moment before he finally spoke, his voice carrying none of the defensiveness I half expected. "I never wanted Isra to know either," he said. "Not because I am ashamed of what I did. I am not, but because I wanted this marriage, this family, to be built on something real. If she had known from the beginning, everything would have been colored by that history. She would have seen the soldier before she ever really saw me. I wanted her to fall for the man who fixes cargo systems and burns dinner more often than he would like to admit, not the man from 6 years of files that no longer exist." I asked him if he regretted leaving that life behind, given how effortlessly he had returned to those instincts during the raid. "No," he said, without hesitation. "That life took things from people I cared about that I am not willing to talk about right now. When I got the chance to walk away, I took it, and I have never once looked back. Last night, I did what I had to do to protect people I love. That does not mean I want to go back to doing it as a way of life. There is a difference between being capable of something and choosing to live inside it every single day." I thought about my own life then, the careful calculations, the endless management of risk and predictability that had defined every major decision I had ever made, including the decision to select him in the first place. I had spent so much energy trying to remove every unpredictable element from Isra's future that I had failed to recognize the difference between danger and strength, between weakness and quiet restraint. Isra found us there a short while later, having been released from the medical bay with instructions to rest. She looked between the two of us, sensing immediately that some kind of conversation had taken place in her absence. "You told her," she said to Daniel, "not quite a question." "Colonel Lang told her most of it," he replied. "I think it was time." Isra crossed her arms, studying me carefully, the way she used to study me during every argument we had ever had about the choices I made on her behalf. "Are you going to lecture me now about how dangerous my husband is?" she asked, a sharp edge creeping into her voice despite her exhaustion. "About how you never would have chosen him if you had known?" "No," I said, and I meant it completely. "I am going to tell you that I was wrong. I thought I was choosing the safest option available to you. I thought I was protecting you by choosing someone I believed had no power to complicate your life. Instead, I gave you someone with more strength than I could have imagined, strength he chooses, every single day, not to use unless it is absolutely necessary. That is not weakness. I was simply too foolish to understand the difference until now." Yizra's expression softened slightly, though I could tell she was still processing everything that had happened over the past day, still carrying the weight of an attack that had nearly taken everything from her. She reached for Daniel's hand without thinking about it, the same easy, unguarded gesture I had witnessed in their kitchen months earlier, and for the first time since arriving at the outpost, I allowed myself to fully believe that my daughter truly was safe, not because I had removed every possible danger from her life, but because the man beside her had chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, to protect her with everything he had. I stayed at the outpost for 3 more days, helping where I could, watching the community slowly begin rebuilding what the raid had damaged. I watched Daniel work quietly alongside his neighbors, never once mentioning what he had done during the attack, never accepting the quiet gratitude offered by families whose children he had saved. He simply continued fixing cargo systems, repairing scaffolding, living the ordinary life he had chosen for himself, as though the events of that night had simply been another difficult day at work rather than a moment that revealed everything I had failed to see about him. By the time I boarded the transport back to my own settlement, I understood something I had never fully grasped before. I had spent my entire career believing that safety came from control, from predictability, from choosing options that appeared weak enough to never threaten the careful order I had built around my life and my daughter's future. I had been searching for weakness when I should have been searching for character. I had found something far more valuable than what I originally set out to choose, and I had very nearly convinced myself to dismiss it as insignificant, simply because it did not match the narrow expectations I had built my entire worldview around. 2 years passed before I finally understood the full weight of everything that had changed in my life since that first wedding day in the Great Hall, and it took a quiet morning on Ezra and Daniel's small porch, watching my grandchild chase a mechanical toy across the floorboards, for the realization to fully settle over me. Her name was Nara, a small girl with Ezra's sharp eyes and Daniel's quiet patience, barely old enough to walk steadily on her own yet already curious about everything within reach. She had inherited traits from both her parents in ways that still surprised me, a stubbornness that reminded me of my daughter as a child, mixed with a calm, watchful quality that could only have come from her father. I found myself smiling as I watched her, something I did far more often now than I ever had during the early years of Ezra's marriage. Daniel sat nearby, repairing a small drone he used for outpost inspections. His movements relaxed and unhurried in a way that no longer surprised me, though it once had seemed impossible to reconcile with what I now knew about his past. Nara toddled toward him at one point, holding up a piece of broken machinery she had found, demanding his attention with the fierce insistence only a toddler can manage. He set his tools aside without hesitation, kneeling to inspect her discovery with the same careful focus I imagined he once brought to far more dangerous situations. It was such a small, ordinary moment, and yet it captured everything I had once failed to understand about the man my daughter had married. The Krathi remnant faction responsible for the raid on Outpost 7 had been dismantled entirely within a year of the attack, their remaining members captured or scattered by a coordinated response effort that involved both Concord security forces and human military support. I later learned, through careful and quiet research that no longer felt like suspicion but simple curiosity, that Daniel had been consulted during that response effort, his knowledge of the group's tactics from that night proving valuable to the officials planning the operation. He never once mentioned this to me directly. I only discovered it through a passing comment from Colonel Lang during a brief follow-up visit months later. That was simply who Daniel was. He did what needed to be done, and then he returned to his quiet life without seeking recognition, without allowing his past to define the present he had deliberately chosen for himself and his family. I thought often, during those 2 years, about the mistake at the very center of everything I had done when arranging Ezra's marriage. I had approached the decision the way I approached every problem in my professional life, searching for the option with the least risk, the least unpredictability, the least potential to disrupt the careful order I believed kept my family safe. I had mistaken quietness for weakness. I had mistaken humility for submission. I had believed that a species new to the wider galaxy, eager for acceptance among older civilizations, would naturally produce partners who were grateful, controllable, and safely beneath notice. I understood now how deeply flawed that assumption had been, not just about Daniel specifically, but about an entire species I had judged too quickly based on incomplete information and my own narrow definition of strength. Humanity, I had come to learn through countless small observations over those 2 years, did not measure strength the way my own people did. They did not need to announce their capabilities constantly to feel secure in them. Some of the most capable individuals I had ever encountered, Daniel among them, seemed to actively prefer quiet, ordinary lives, using whatever extraordinary skills they carried only when genuinely necessary, and setting them aside completely the rest of the time. That restraint, I realized, was not the absence of strength. It was strength refined into something far more valuable, the wisdom to know when force was needed and the discipline to choose peace whenever it was not. Ezra joined us on the porch that afternoon, settling beside me with a cup of warm tea, watching Nara continue her determined exploration of the yard under Daniel's careful supervision. She had grown so much since that first tense conversation in her room the night before her wedding, no longer the reluctant daughter forced into an arrangement she resented, but a woman who had built a life she genuinely wanted, alongside a partner she had chosen to trust completely once she understood exactly who he was. "You know," she said after a while, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth, "you never actually apologized properly for choosing him without asking me first." I laughed, an easy, unguarded sound that surprised even me. "I did apologize," I reminded her, "several times, if I recall correctly." "You apologized for underestimating him," she corrected. "That is different from apologizing for making the decision without me in the first place." She was right, of course. I set my tea aside and looked at her directly, allowing myself, for once, to speak without the careful calculation that usually guided every conversation I had ever had. "I am sorry," I told her. "Not because the choice turned out badly. It clearly did not. I am sorry because I treated your future like a problem to be solved through careful planning, rather than a life you deserve to build for yourself. I got fortunate that the man I chose without your input turned out to be far better than I understood at the time. That does not excuse the fact that I never should have made that choice for you in the first place." Isra studied me for a long moment, something softening in her expression that told me the apology had finally reached the place it needed to reach. "I forgive you," she said quietly, "mostly because Nara adores her father, and I have never been happier than I am right now, but also because I think you have actually changed since that wedding day. You used to see everything as a risk to be managed. Now you just watch him with her and you smile." She was right about that too. I had changed, slowly and quietly, over those 2 years, learning lessons I never expected to learn at this stage of my life. I had learned that strength did not always announce itself loudly. I had learned that the quietest, most unremarkable choices sometimes carried depths I was not prepared to measure using the tools I had relied on my entire career. I had learned that my daughter, given the chance, was capable of building a life far richer and more genuine than anything I could have engineered on her behalf, no matter how carefully I calculated the risks. As the sun began to lower over the outpost that evening, casting long golden light across the porch, I watched Daniel lift Nara onto his shoulders, her delighted laughter carrying across the yard as he walked her slowly toward the garden, pointing out something in the distance that had caught her attention. Isra watched them both with quiet contentment, and I found myself thinking back to that wedding day, to the flicker of unease I had felt watching the humans in attendance regard Daniel with quiet respect I did not yet understand. I had spent so long believing I was choosing the weakest, safest option available for my daughter's future, a decision built entirely on control and low expectations, on the assumption that a species still finding its place among the stars would never produce someone capable of standing against real danger, let alone someone who could calmly protect an entire outpost while asking for nothing in return. I had been wrong about all of it, and I had never been more grateful to be wrong in my entire life. Somewhere behind that quiet, unremarkable file I had once dismissed as unremarkable, sat a man who had chosen gentleness not because he lacked the capacity for anything else, but because he understood, more deeply than my own people ever had, that true strength was not measured by what you were capable of doing, but by what you chose not to do, day after ordinary day, simply because peace was worth choosing whenever peace remained possible. I watched my grandchild laugh in her father's arms as the evening settled over the outpost, and for the first time in my long, carefully calculated life, I allowed myself to simply feel grateful, without analyzing the risk, without searching for the pattern, without needing to understand every variable before allowing myself to trust the outcome. I had thought it was best to marry my daughter to a human. I had been wrong about my reasons, wrong about my assumptions, wrong about nearly everything I believed I understood when I made that choice. But watching the family sitting before me now, I understood at last that being wrong, in this particular case, had given my daughter something far greater than the safe, predictable life I had originally intended to provide. It had given her a real one,